Hello and welcome to what, unless I'm having a serious memory lapse, I believe is the first ever live Serious Inquiries Only recording. Thank God. I was totally ready to do a Jeb Bush please clap. I really was. And then have to explain that. Well, no, you guys follow probably American Politics. No, thank you so much for coming, and I'm sorry that you got turned away at the other two events. But no, I'm glad you're here. No, it's great. It looks like a full house, and we have at least, when I post this, there's at least 10 to 12 people listening online. So thank you all. I'm really excited to be here. I'm really excited to do this episode. I have, of course, Emma McClure, who you all will be more familiar with than you are with me. I'm sure she was here last year, right?
Yeah, last year. Yeah.
And I'm very excited to be talking to you. We're going to talk about, well, it's hard to put it in, we still can't figure out how to put this in a concise, fortune cookie-like phrase. But prison and what we're trying to do and what it should be for and what it is and all that good stuff. But first, Emma McClure, please introduce yourself, especially to the people listening at home who might not be familiar from QED last year, and tell us what you do and a little bit of your backstory.
Okay, so I'm Emma McClure. I am, when I'm feeling pretentious, I describe myself as a human rights lawyer. More specifically, I represent people who are detained either in prison or in hospital at proceedings where they are arguing that they shouldn't be detained anymore. I've done that for quite a few years, and I also do a lot of public speaking in relation to the issues around that and the problems and the difficulties, and then trying to get more public awareness of what's going on in those areas.
Oh, that I'm sure there's more you could say, but okay, all right, we'll stick with that. I just wanted to start off, I think, by talking about what I would understand. You know, I assume we're pretty much all atheists here. I think maybe not. I don't know. But one thing that I think is interesting is how we maybe we are, but how we ought to be thinking about things like prison, punishment for crime, that sort of thing, rehabilitation, in light of not believing in a God, or at least also recognizing the role of moral luck in our lives. I, for one, was very smart to have been born where I was and when I was, but I know you all didn't work for it. I did. I coordinated before I was born exactly when and where I wanted to be. It was hard work, and I deserve credit for it. But most people don't do that. We don't really get to choose that. And I think that it can be uncomfortable, I'm sure, to see what can often be really viscerally horrible crime be committed, but also to try to react to it in a way where if we were just a bunch of robots, who were all maximally rational, if there is such a thing, how would we treat that criminal robot? Well, I suppose we just reprogram them or something. There'd be some bleeps and bloops and be like, we fixed it. And they'd be like, why did you bleep and bloop? We're all robots. You don't even need to bleep and bloop. It's cosmetic. It's just for fun, bleeps and bloops. No, that would be exactly what would happen. But no, like how should, just one person. They're probably a robot. No, how should we think of it in light of that? And comparing that to how we actually do think about and treat prisoners and offenders and people who have committed crime and who might, have mental illness, have background reasons, substance reasons, whatever it is, where when you take those away or when you treat those, they may no longer be a threat. I know in the US, we have something called American exceptionalism. Maybe you've heard of it. We imprison the most people. So I know you're jealous, but we don't even try to compete. We were talking before, and I think we both had been confused on one statistic, but the US actually does imprison the most, both per capita and just in total. I'm amazed at what we're able to achieve. Just go America. I guess you guys have a few people that you've here have to imprison. So let's talk about that. Let's talk about, maybe prison population and your quaint little situation you have here compared to our literally 2.5 million people we incarcerate.
Yeah, so as of yesterday, because it's every Friday the Ministry of Justice produced their statistics. There were 83,232 people in prison in England and Wales. There's about 10,000 more for Scotland and Ireland if you add them on, and that's out of a total usable capacity in the prison system of 85,464. So we are almost full, but we certainly couldn't fit millions in like Thomas has.
Like I did play some no small role in that. Yeah, and I do just have to. It's not exactly what we're talking about today, but I do just have to hit on the fact that in the U.S. this is vastly disproportionately Black men. 40% of the total prison population is Black men, and they are only 13% of the actual population. And it's a huge issue. It's something that I care a lot about, and but it's kind of a different discussion on its own. But I have to mention it. And there's another stat that I just wanted to throw out there. By age 23 in the US, 50% of Black men have been arrested at some point in their life. That's just mind-blowing. But also, in other good news, we've realized there's an untapped market of people we could put in prison, and that's women. And this is totally true. The rates of incarceration in the US of women are skyrocketing. They're going up more than men. They're I guess, again, because it was an untapped market. We were like, oh, stupid. Of course. We can put everybody in prison. Next will be pets and, things like that. Yeah. For the really bad ones.
Out of the figures, the figure I just gave, the 83,000 figure, it's just under 4,000 of those are women. So almost all of
it is still, it is still vastly men, but the rate of increase is a lot higher for women right now. And so... what does this note mean? Sorry. Okay. So the overcrowding is interesting. You had a story about a particular facility that I found interesting. You want to talk about that?
Well, there's a few Victorian prisons that were built during the reign of Victoria, specifically around this area. There's Strangeways and there's Liverpool prison nearby. And so they were built in the Victorian area, and the cells that are there were designed for single occupancy, so one prisoner at a time. And at the moment in Walton Jail, you've got 4 people in cells that were designed for one person during the Victorian era. So they're a little bit full, which is not useful when you're trying to rehabilitate people when they're in such cramped conditions.
Yeah, and what about that window?
Oh,
story?
The window.
Yeah,
yes.
mention that.
I had a client who was in Liverpool prison, and he was complaining to me about the fact that he had no window. He kept telling me he had no window in his cell. And at first I was a bit confused. I was like, well, you are in prison. There's going to be some things you don't have for a little while. But then so after a bit of a back and forth, it transpired what he was saying wasn't that he had no window. It was that he had no glass in the window in the cell. This was in January. Because Liverpool prison has gotten a little bit better recently because they've come under a new governor and they are making changes. But earlier on in the year, what was happening was, because there is such a problem with illicit substances getting into the prisons via various means, including drones, and people who are involved in that are bashing out the windows, and it's happening so frequently that the prison just stopped replacing them. And this particular gentleman is sat in a cell in January with no glass in his window.
It's like if they have food fights, they're like, fine, no more food. That's the way that does solve that. It is really horrifying. If we had your U.S. equivalent, I'm sure there'd be a really fun one-upsmanship that could go on for hours. But we don't have that, so we'll have to talk about the UK system. But I guess philosophically, we should talk a little bit about, what is this for? And certainly, again, in my very exceptional country, it is for being really awful to people who did bad things. It's like, people did bad things. How do we make them miserable? Is basically what it is. I mean,
that's what you'd think. Looking from the outside, knowing nothing else about it, that's what you'd assume.
Honestly, it's pretty explicit sometimes. I mean, there are tough on crime is the only option. There's no. I'm going to talk more about that later, but there is no. Let's maybe not be so tough on crime option politically in the U.S. It's just not. I don't think anyway that I've seen. I don't think it's tenable. It always has to be any. There are programs, there are things we can do to help them, to make their lives better and to make them more able to succeed afterward. And oftentimes it's hard to even get that done because it's like, well, why are we even doing that? They're bad people. We've put them in a bad place, and then that's what should happen. And it's really distressing. It's not, it doesn't serve anybody really, except for a sense of vengeance that I think, interestingly enough, has kind of been tied to evangelical Christianity in my country. And I would just think there's all these things I have as an atheist and as somebody who speaks to religious people sometimes. There's all these assumptions that I would have. Like if I were religious and I thought, okay, we have this one little dance we all do here for no reason for 70 years ish. Don't know why we're doing that because we have infinite time after that. But I would think, okay, well, if after that is when all the punishy stuff happens, what are we wasting our time? God, you're in charge of that after. And by the way, it's going to be a lot longer, infinitely longer and more effective. So I never understand that. Somehow, though, if you're religious, it's like, no, we got to put them in prison forever and then they'll suffer an eternity after that. I feel like, what's the difference of a few years? But no, that's very much the attitude. Do you find, first off, I guess I'll ask you, what would, in your ideal world, what do you think we should be trying to do? What do you think the purpose of prison should be? And then maybe how do you see the UK system maybe falling short of that or maybe not?
Well, I could answer that for the rest of the podcast, but I'll
sure,
I'll be brief. No, I come at it from the similar place to you in terms of I am an atheist, and so if I think about what I want to achieve, I then don't have the sort of the faith-based thing where sort of the idea of sin and badness, and then if you just sort of if I take Christianity as an example, then find Jesus and my sins are forgiven and that fixes it. That it doesn't work as an explanation for me. So we need to try and work harder to work out what the causes of people causing very serious harm is. So the purpose of prison should be that when someone has committed very serious crime or caused some very serious harm, and they are an ongoing risk to society, they should be quarantined in some way in a prison setting, in a sort of secure setting, until we are as sure as we can be that they are not going to do something similar again. And obviously, you would hope while they were in quarantine that you could do various things or try and identify what's caused the problems so that when they go back out again, they're not going to then do the same thing. That's what ideally that's what should happen, and that's what they try to do. But the problem we've got at the moment with the prison system is that in order to try and rehabilitate people or to sort of to help them, they need first of all be in a stable environment. The environment has to be stable for learning, and the current prison system is in a complete crisis. You see some of this in the news at the moment. There was something about HMP Lindholm near Doncaster yesterday, where the Ministry of Justice haven't said anything officially about it, but the BBC were reporting it. A prison officer was strangled to unconsciousness by an inmate, and then some of the staff were refusing to go back on shift, and that's just one thing that happened yesterday. The number of staff has greatly reduced, and not only that, the experience of the staff has greatly reduced. I saw an interesting statistic. So in 2010, which is before austerity in the UK kicked in, there was about 25,000 operational staff in the prison system, and only 1.25% of them had experience of less than a year. As of June this year, the staff numbers is 21,600, and 22% of them, so about 5,000 of them, have less than a year's experience. And so you've got not enough staff there who are inexperienced. You've got too many prisoners for them to look after. And that's the crux of the problem. And then a whole load of other things follow on from that cause other problems. So because there aren't enough staff, there's powerful and organised criminal elements, because it's a prison, there are criminals in there, get involved in the drug trade and things like that. And the organised criminal element take the place of where there should be experienced staff who can control the situation, because prisons only work through the consent of the prisoners. If the prisoners in the prison didn't consent to most of them didn't consent to the regime that was going on, they'd completely collapse immediately. You're looking at me quizzically,
Oh,
Tom.
yeah, no. Here in the U.S. Where this is being broadcast. No, I can't recover that. I don't know that I would say that applies there. I think one thing we were talking about, which is interesting, is that being a prison guard, being a correction officer in the U.S. is actually a very well-paying job, and I think we have. Yeah, I'm sure you could always use more, but I think it's pretty well staffed there too. I think it's a good industry. It seems that's an interesting difference that here it's not. It seems like it's not a well-paid job.
It's not
the
well-paid.
worst job. I couldn't imagine taking that job. You couldn't pay me.
You personally could not pay me to be a prison officer in the UK at the moment. It's absolutely appalling, and it creates this completely chaotic environment. And there's no way that you can successfully even try to rehabilitate people in that environment, especially because of the way that they deal and try and bring some order is stuff like you may have seen in the news. They've just approved the use of synthetic pepper spray. They're going to give the prison officers synthetic pepper spray to deal with incidents now.
We have guns.
Yeah, which might help temporarily the symptoms of what's going on, but that is not going to help. I am waiting with bated breath as to how that's going to go disastrously wrong, probably quite soon.
Well, it's here that I always like to turn to the Thomas Jefferson of our time in terms of commentary, which is The Onion, which has the most. And I quote this all the time. Is the best. The Onion headline was 15 years in environment of constant fear somehow fails to rehabilitate prisoner. It's like, yeah, well, that's what we do. It's curious that it's also happening here, but that is definitely what we do in the U.S. We subject people to what is hell on earth, like literally the worst thing. And then when they're done, it's like, okay, so you should be fine now, right? Like you should totally be better. You know, you just went through absolute hell. Like, can you imagine that being a realistic expectation? And, I also want to tie in something, if you don't mind, just a quick little tangent, but it relates. I've in a couple times when I've been sort of arguing on the merits of Me Too and that sort of thing, one thing that gets brought up, is sort of the gotcha kind of thing is, well, did you know more men are actually the victims of sexual assault when you count the prison population in the U.S. and it's true, but it's also men who are doing it, so that's all men pretty much. But B, when I think about Me Too, and this is something I found kind of interesting when I was thinking it through, I think from my interpretation anyway, one of the biggest benefits as a society of this moment for us is recognizing that we don't believe victims and women often enough, that we don't let them tell their stories, we don't properly weight their stories in terms of evidence. And when you compare that with what's going on in US prisons, that's not at all an issue. Every American knows it's happening and is fine with it. If there were an inmate who went on TV somehow and was like, I was sexually assaulted in prison, everyone would be like, yeah, that's prison. That definitely happened. There wouldn't be the same like, do you have proof? Do you have whatever? Like it's really interesting. And it's disturbing, but I think that's true. I think as a society, we're somehow fine with that, to the point where, I remember back when a major celebrity, towering figure in U.S. culture, Jared from Subway, when he turned out to be awful, I even from time to time, I think I had a lot of arguments with skeptics and atheists about making prison rape jokes about that. He's going to be, this will be happening to him in prison, and it's not funny. It's really awful. It's really, really awful that this is just a thing we do. Like we just subject human beings to sexual assault and rape and the worst kind of punishment as like that they deserve it, and that's a tool. It's kind of biblical in a way, in a horrible way, in a way that the Bible's horrible, and it's disturbing that we're just okay with that. And then, as the Onion says, then it's like, okay, now you should be fine. If anything, you're probably worse, after going through that. So sorry for the the tangent there, but I mean, really, how do we expect people to be better after going through that experience and have less of a chance of reoffending?
Well, you can't. It doesn't. It doesn't work in any other area of society. And then on top of that, once you've come out, and then there's a very clear lack of support for people who come out of custody. Quite often, people who are released in the UK will get their £46 discharge grant, and that's it. Off you go. Go and sort yourself out. With no other support.
Well, let's talk about parole a little bit. I think we both tried to research the U.S. system a little bit, and it's hard because there's 50 states and they're all different, and we couldn't. Yeah, it was hard to find exactly if there's any set guidelines. I don't think there's any like federal. This is what needs to happen. But I did come across a story that I think is interesting. I don't know. Should I tell that now, or do you want to? I don't know. Okay, I'll keep talking. Now I'm on a roll. No, I did happen to come across a story that I think illustrates the point pretty well about how much Americans anyway, and I don't know how much this applies to the UK, but how much we just want people to go in a hole and stay there forever. And we don't really care about whether or not they're better, which is that apparently in New York, and this will transition well into some other stuff that you were going to talk about. It just happened a few days ago. This is a big topic of Republican Fox News ire in New York. Someone who was convicted of killing, they were part of a group, they were part of the Black Nationalist Part, Black Freedom, something, Black Liberation Army, that's what it was. And he was, this man, Herman Bell, was part of a group of this Black Liberation Army who was responsible for killing 2 police officers in 1971. So, obviously serious crime, no arguing that. And he was sentenced to 25 years to life for whatever that ends up meaning. It's hard. Seems like it could be anything under our system. But he was eventually so he's released this year, I believe, which is doing some math, 46, 7 years later. So 25 to life, you get 40 going on 50 years. That feels like, okay, you did the 25 to life, that I feel like you've served your time. But there's uproar for him having been released, for the parole board granting him release. And then because of something Governor Cuomo did, which I think is good. And again, going to transition to what Emma's going to talk about here. He granted certain felons the right to vote, because that's another thing we do in America. Again, it's really exceptional country. We systematically imprison Black men way more frequently than any other group, and then we take away their right to vote forever, and then we don't give them jobs and that kind of thing. And it's a serious issue. And this was an uproar. And here's the thing that I find maybe the most disturbing about this, is that when Republicans and Fox News started going nuts about this, about the fact that this man just voted and he probably voted for a Democrat, even though he served going on 50 years, is Cuomo had to say, the Democrat had to say, well, clearly that was the wrong decision to let him out. I wouldn't have made that decision, but the parole board was appointed by, Republicans, so don't blame me for that. And essentially caved, as though like if you got 25 to life, that means you should just die in prison forever. Like no matter what the circumstances, no matter what you've said or done or your behavior, none of that, irrespective of that, you should just stay in there forever. And furthermore, you should never be able to vote. And it's amazing to me. One thing, I meant to say this too, when we're talking about parole, let's talk about how the parole system works in the UK. And also, I wanted to ask you, when you were talking about the fact that, some sentences are, it is, you to some extent in the UK, you are trying to minimize the likelihood that someone's going to reoffend and eventually let them out, and certainly a lot sooner than in the US. How do victims play into that? Do they get a voice? Because that's what happens in the US, is this police officer's, I think, wife is still alive, and she says, this guy should die in prison. And so everyone's like, well, yeah, if the victim says that, then forever. And how does that play out here?
So there's been some news about this going on at the moment because there was some high profile cases where victims hadn't been notified that people were coming up for parole or were eligible for parole. In fact, it was a surprise to them that they were ever going to be eligible for parole, which is a failing in the system. But in terms of the part they play in the parole system, they are entitled to be kept informed about when someone is eligible for parole. They can submit a statement about how they feel about that and anything that any concerns that they have about that person being released, and they can come to the parole hearing. They can say it to the parole panel in person if they wish, and then obviously the parole board will take that into account. But the parole board's role is to determine whether or not that person's risk of serious harm is manageable, and that is it. So obviously some of the conditions that might go on somebody will be there to protect that victim from further serious harm of accidentally running into that person or anything like that. But the victims don't get to determine what happens.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And hypothetically, they don't in our system. It's just the political pressure, I think, and just the overall cultural attitude. And certainly, I don't mean to say that they shouldn't be taken into account in probably most parts of the system. But this idea that if the victim wants truly unethical and just overwhelmingly excessive punishment, that's what we ought to do every time, then that to me just seems there has to be some limit. It
comes back into sort of maybe skepticism more than atheism. Is I am lucky enough to never been the victim of a serious crime. So I don't know exactly what it would feel like to be the victim of a serious crime. But I have people close to me who have been a victim of serious crime, and I think about the person that did that to my relative, and I think I could stab them in the eyes.
Yeah.
But I before the fact recognize that I am being irrational, and that wouldn't be the best thing to do in terms of
absolutely. And that's kind of what I was getting at the beginning. It is really hard to keep that in mind at all times. If I envision a family member being a victim, it really, I don't know any that I can guarantee at all that I would be able to treat that person rationally. But that's why we need not me to decide what happens to the person.
If we I wanted to come back to the thing you were saying about
voting rights.
About voting.
Yes.
So in the UK, people who've been in prison are allowed to vote. When your sentence is finished, you're allowed to vote. So we are.
No matter what, when you're out, you're voting.
You're allowed to vote.
Okay, yeah, we don't have that.
But so the argument that was had in this country it was about a decade ago at this point, was about whether or not people who were serving sentences could vote. And the argument for that is that so out of those 83 odd thousand people who are currently in prison, all but about 70 of them have, at least theoretically, a time when they will be back in the community, because in the UK there's only about 70 people who have whole life tariffs who will never be eligible for parole. And you want them to be engaged in society so that they are, so if they have an investment in society, that they are less likely to do things that damage it. And that's the argument for it. But a lot of people, and especially politicians, and it was David Cameron, who was Prime Minister at the time, that this was going through the courts, said that the idea of prisoners voting made him feel physically ill, which he did some things that made me feel physically ill. But
I get that.
I'm referring to the Brexit referendum.
Oh, okay. Yeah, no, I hate that. Okay, good.
But the European Court of Human Rights, which we are still a member of at the moment, came down and said that you need to, it can't be a blanket ban on all prisoners. You need to think about this and allow some prisoners to vote. Some of them are on very short sentences, and this doesn't make any sense. And the government were just like, no. And then they did make one exception, but it was such a small exception it applied to about 12 people. But that's where we're at. And then, whilst that litigation was going on, there are a few prison newspapers which are circulated throughout the prison system. This is an interesting side note anecdote. So there's Inside Times, which is the equivalent of a broadsheet newspaper. There's Converse, which is the equivalent of a tabloid newspaper. Just as an aside, the firm I work for advertised in the Converse newspaper, And we have a full page advert, which occasionally I will write stories about things that I've been doing for the firm's purposes. And that advert is on, and it's got my photograph on it. And that advert is on page 3 of that newspaper. just my face. But back to the...
That I do get because she explained it to me earlier. I'm very confused still, but at least I understand what's happening.
So,
for my American listeners, though, you may need to explain why that's funny.
There's a tabloid newspaper in the UK that every day on page 3 publishes a picture of a topless woman.
Yeah, you say that, and it's the second time I've heard. I still don't understand. That's just a thing. Like, just a thing.
Yeah.
Just like there's a giant tomato in the middle of this city forever. No explanation. Like I don't get it. Like, okay.
Yeah,
Anyway.
So to come to so one of the newspapers ran a pretend election with the prisoners to see if they were allowed to vote, what would happen. And obviously Thomas was saying there about how the Republicans were saying they would obviously vote Democrat because, liberal, whatever. They're actually quite conservative because what happened was, first of all, the turnout was appalling. And the BNP would have won. So.
Yeah, it's funny. I made a joke about this a long time ago on one of my shows because it was in the news, like should felons get, and for the record, that's already what you have is already way better than what we have, which is not only can they not vote in prison, but once they're out, there's just a really good John Oliver. You guys, is he good here? Okay, good. He's not one of the ones that left that you hate. Okay, good. Yeah. No, he's fantastic. And they did it was really rage-inducing, this program about, in Florida, this panel that Governor Scott, I think it is, has that's just like 3 people that one of them, they're just nonsense people. They're just absolute nonsense people. And these ex-felons, one black man who was probably in his 70s, had served his time, has been living out there, just totally respectable life for decades, and he's just trying to get the right to vote. And it's very religion based. They're just like, well, I'm gonna pray on it, but I don't think so. And it's demeaning, and it just makes me sick to think that these this panel of assholes that someone decided get to choose whether or not they get their constitutional rights, after they've served their time. It just made me so mad. But I made a joke a few years back before this when I was thinking about it, and I was like, I don't even really understand what the problem is. Do people think that if you give prisoners the right to vote, they're going to elect like a prisoner as president? Like there's going to be like, oh, I'm definitely voting for like Voldemort, for like they're all evil. They're like voting for the Dementors to be in charge. No, they're just going to vote for whoever is running. And especially here, when, again, you have a paltry 80,000 or so prisoners. I mean, that's statistically not very significant. But even in the U.S., yes, nationally, it's 2.5 million, which is still not a whole lot in terms of, I mean, if all of them voted, it's a pretty big effect. But when you look at like if you divide it out where it is, it's not like that's going to make a huge effect. And as you say, if they're pretty split anyway, it's so mind-boggling to me. Like they should just have their right to vote for the most part. But yeah, was there any more you wanted to say on the voting rights for?
No, I think that was
just explain page 3 a few more times. Okay. Does anybody have an example? No, I'm just kidding.
I'll tell everyone not to buy The Sun.
What did you say?
I said I'm going to tell everyone not to buy The Sun.
Okay.
Woo!
Okay. Let's talk about the sentencing differences in, again, the U.S. versus UK, because we were, again, trying to find some statistics, and I'll give my side.
Okay.
What I can find is that in terms of life sentences, there's something like, here, let me make sure I have it right. In the U.S., there are 162,000 inmates serving a life sentence, which I think is 25 years, I guess. And then a further 44,311 people are serving a virtual life sentence, which is 50 years or more, and it's defined as any sentence where it's likely they will die in custody. So 44,311. What is that number here?
So in terms of how out of the 83 odd thousand people, 14% of them, which I haven't done the maths on that, but about 14% of them have what are called indeterminate sentences, which means that they'll have a minimum period of time they have to serve, which is known as the punishment part. And then after that, they are theoretically then able to be released by the parole board if the parole board think they are safe to be released. So those people could technically be in prison forever if they're considered to be dangerous, but possibly get out. Then there's only about 70, as I mentioned before, who have whole life orders, and that's 68 men and 2 women. You have to be quite bad to get one of those in the UK.
So you kind of buried the lead there, but that was 44,300 versus 70. I think that's a stark difference. But yeah, no, of course you had to be precise in your stats because you're responsible. You want to make sure people properly understood the numbers you were using. No, I'm just kidding. Yeah, no, that is really, again, I think that highlights that difference in philosophy. And, we want to lock you up and throw away I was going to say, throw you away and throw away the key. And it's not that much different. Lock you up and throw away the key versus here, it does seem like there's at least some more consideration given to when someone is safe to leave. So do you want to talk about maybe that, what goes into that difference? And then also, again, parole, how is that supposed to work here? How does it work? All those questions and more right now.
So in terms of parole, so as I mentioned earlier, when someone becomes eligible for parole, the parole board are deciding whether or not their risk of causing serious harm is manageable in the community. And that's very specific to serious harm. So if there's loads of evidence, the first thing someone's going to do when they leave is go and steal some vodka from Asda, for example. But that's it. Then the parole board don't care about that because that's not serious harm.
I'm very curious about that evidence. Just a journal, like diary, like, I just really need some vodka.
Well, no, I have had clients who have substance misuse problems who commit very large numbers of thefts to fund their drug habit, but they're not violent.
And so, are we talking different levels? So when you're talking about this parole board in particular, is this just serious offenders you're talking about, like people who've committed serious crimes?
So the people that I run into generally are on the more serious end anyway, because they have received indeterminate sentences, and you only get an indeterminate sentence if you've committed a serious crime.
Okay.
But that's the bulk of what I do. But I also represent people. The parole board also deal with people who have been released on license, who are recalled back to custody, having breached their license.
But the bit about the vodka was you're saying that if they're evaluating whether they can be released, they're just looking at serious harm. They're not even like if they think this person is going to steal, they're still going to release them?
Yeah.
Because okay.
It used to be.
Watch your vodka, everybody. Hang on to you.
The test used to be sort of colloquially known as a life and limb test. And that can include serious psychological harm. It's not just physical harm, but that's what they have to look at. And so the way that they determine that is by seeing it. Do they have a good enough understanding of why it happened the first time or the previous times, and have we got compelling evidence that it's going to be different next time? And the way that you do that is hopefully you've there are. This is where it gets a bit difficult because at the moment it's hard to do because of the state of the prison system. And also, even if you can get on some of the courses that they have to try and improve people's behavior, the evidence base for those courses is extremely poor. Last year, there's a course that used to be run for people who've committed sexual offences called the Sex Offender Treatment Programme, which last year the government produced a study. That course has been run for decades all over the prison estate. And I don't know if it was in the US, it was definitely in Canada as well.
So this is a program to try to make sure to reduce recidivism.
Address the causes of sexual offending. And they discovered that at best, it was doing nothing.
It's not a good start. I don't think there's any way you can finish that. That's good. Pretty sure.
And at worst, it was making people worse.
And worst, it gave you $1 million.
Yeah, so
no,
I'm,
that
because
doesn't.
I'm now in a position where I have some clients who have committed sexual offences, and we're coming to parole hearings, and they've done those courses, and I'm now having to we're trying to argue the fact that they're not worse.
Yeah.
Not just that.
Oh wow.
Yeah, that that's not made them worse. Not that.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
That's horrible.
Mm.
So,
and it's been replaced by another course that's not accredited or tested either.
That is interesting. It would be nice if we had solid data. That seems like something worthwhile to research. What outcomes and what.
Yeah, it's quite hard sometimes to get the Ministry of Justice to give. The only reason that we got that study was because journalists were pressuring them to release it, because they quietly stopped. So they stopped doing the course without really explaining why. And then that came out. And then at the moment, everyone's FOIing them at the moment they did a small pilot study on the synthetic pepper spray, because they've been testing it in a couple of prisons, and they did that. They said that was successful. They said it was successful, but we've got no idea what the criteria for success were.
Properly spicing your food. So we've got about 10 minutes left. I want to make sure we talk about the kinds of people you've represented. I know, and as a disclaimer, of course, there's plenty specifics you can't talk about.
Yeah, there's some specific.
Ethically,
specifically, I've talked about a specific case on another podcast, Skeptics with a K, before, which I cannot talk about.
Yeah, but that aside, in speaking in generalities,
Yeah, in general. So I don't like to sort of not categorize, give a hierarchy to
sure,
like what the worst offences are. But I've represented. If in my head I do have you still have a hierarchy of what's really really bad and what's not so bad, and so I've represented people who've murdered children, for example, or committed child sex offences, and the whole gambit of things. And
even as the hyper rational robots that everyone in this room is, that sounds hard to do.
Yeah.
How do you feel when you do that, and what is that like?
So part of it, for me, it actually isn't that hard for me, which I think says something I don't know what, but something about my personality, and I'm able to separate myself from the emotion of what they have done with my job, which is to advise them in relation to whether or not it's likely that they're going to be released. But one thing that does help is that, with the exception of like very few people, none of these people who've committed the absolute worst of things had what I'm going to describe as a happy childhood. There's quite often very clear, obvious societal reasons that have made them not necessarily guaranteed they'll do something, but made them much more susceptible to something like that happening. And even the people who've got psychopathy, who are diagnosed as being psychopathic, they didn't choose that either.
Right.
And so,
but also something you said to me before this that I want to make sure to say, because I think it also helps people realize you're not just trying to get child killers out on the street as a hobby, is that you do seem to have a real trust in the parole board and in that system. Can you talk about that?
So, so people will go, how on earth can you represent and help and argue that this child killer should be back in the community? How on earth can I be that person's advocate? And first of all, the answer to that is that the parole board don't just release people. The parole board also make other decisions about what else needs to be done in someone's case. And quite often, if I think that someone is not ready for release, or I think that they're not going to be successful at a release application, I pride myself that I'm quite good at advising people, and they will take my advice about what we're actually asking for in the first place. But even if we are making a release application in a case that I think that person is dangerous, the parole board.
And just to highlight, just fill it in. You are good, and you advise them. You're good at advising them, like, hey, this is too much doubt. You're not going to get released.
Managing their expectations.
However, they still have the right to tell
they have the right to make if they've passed the minimum term,
no.
They have the right to ask for release. That's their right. And if they still want to do that after I've told them it's unlikely, then we do that, and I do that to the best of my ability. But I have a reasonable expectation based on, I was going to say faith, but I don't have faith. I have a reasonable belief based on evidence that the parole board generally make the right decisions. I know they've been in the press this year with some of the decisions that they've made and concerns about them releasing terribly dangerous people. But the rate at which people released by the parole board commit serious offences is under 1%. And it has been consistently for a long time, despite the fact the number of hearings they've been having has gone up very, very large amounts in recent years. But the reoffence rate has stayed the same, which indicates to me that they're actually doing quite a good job. Now, it can be hard to try and justify to the public if it happens, because they will often have the view, if it happens once, it's gone wrong. They expect the system to be perfect. And another thing that comes down to having a rational and skeptical outlook is understanding that it can't be perfect.
Yeah. Because the minute there's a car accident, we better get rid of cars for sure. Thank God that hasn't happened yet. We still have cars.
I have never represented someone who I thought was still a danger to society, who then got released. I've had plenty of clients who've gotten released and then gotten recalled because they breached their conditions, but that is not the same as them going and murdering somebody or something like that.
But it is, yes, but it is a possibility. I would that must be very. Imagine that would be very difficult. But I'm glad. So you know the data, you know the numbers, and that has given you the ability to think rationally and say that the chances are so small that this is, that tiny chance is probably a lot less than the chances of some everyday awful thing happening all the time. But when it's in the news that this one person that they let go did this one awful thing, it just has such an impact on society. But that hasn't seemed to, so far anyway, affected how harsh they're being. It hasn't.
Well, at the present time, in my experience, this is anecdote, not data, but in my experience, since quite a high-profile case at the start of the year, where the parole board made a release decision that was highly unpopular in the press, and they were then successfully sued, so had to remake that decision.
Wow.
I'm not sure that the outcome is known about what happened with that, or if it's happened again yet. But the since then, they have been significantly more conservative in terms of the decisions. In my experience, they are deferring cases and adjourning cases for lots more information that they previously weren't.
That's how it starts. You're going to be at 2.5 million in a few decades. No, really, it's a tough thing it does seem like kind of a spiraling thing of just always, no, we need to play it more conservative, But wow, we're already pretty low on time. I did want to make sure to ask you, there's certain interesting statistics and maybe counterintuitive things you've mentioned to me about who are the people who are likely to reoffend. Like generically, what kind of person is someone where you're thinking statistically, no, this person probably will reoffend seriously, versus no, actually they won't, even though it seems like they might, they won't. Can you give some examples?
There's things like
hypothetical.
Well, there's things like whether or not someone admits they did it, and whether or not that's evidence of them being more or less likely to reoffend. There isn't a great deal of evidence, but the studies and things that have been done seem to suggest that maintenance of innocence actually is a protective factor, that people are less likely to reoffend if they say they didn't offend in the first place.
Yeah. But I think there's a lot of emphasis. I forget if you said it was in the US or the UK, but some in the US, or there's somewhere there's a lot of emphasis.
So as you said before, it's a bit hard to get proper data on the US system because it's all different. But from what I watch a lot of
Law and Order.
Stuff.
Yeah.
I watch a lot of documentaries about.
Oh yeah, that's what I meant too. I watch a lot of very serious things.
From what I can tell from the US system, that is much more based on whether or not someone has shown enough remorse yet and stuff, and they quite often they don't seem to be represented at all. And
I don't think they are. We're trying to figure that out. Unfortunately, it is, again, it's probably different everywhere, but I don't. It doesn't seem like they are. So that doesn't have any effect. And I think with statistically thinking through that, I guess there could be some offsetting amount of people who are actually innocent, and so that's why they're maintaining their innocence, and so therefore they don't reoffend because they never offended in the first place. But that's also, even still, it's very curious that that has no effect that you can see. Is there anything else like that you want to share in the? Oh, we have 1 minute. Okay. What do you? Give me your best knock joke. No, what do you got? Give me.
I wanted to it was just in terms of we were talking about what prison is for and how what people we want to be in prison, and I just wanted to highlight something that there's in the prison population is increasingly aging, and there are a significant number of people in custody who are quite old, and there's a growing proportion of people who are in custody for committing historic sex offences. And so these are people who've committed offences decades ago. There's no evidence of anything in the middle, and then they've been obviously the victims of their offending have come forward or whatever, they've been convicted, and they're serving a sentence. And I've had the unfortunate experience now of people who are extremely elderly in custody, who have dementia, who have to be every morning when they wake up, they have to be told where they are and why they're there. And I just even when someone's committed the most horrible of offences, like a child sex offence, is that really the best use of resources when someone doesn't even know why they're in prison?
Yeah. Well, on that note,
sorry,
I think it's time's up. I want to thank you guys so much for coming. This was really fun to do. A super fun topic, really zany. Everybody's like loving it. No, thank you for coming. It's the first ever live SIO, and thank you, Emma, so much for sharing everything.